lots of horrible things have happened over the last 100 years. Lots of horrible things have happened this week. So it's important to celebrate the good things, and the Balfour Declaration was a very good thing. 124 carefully crafted and intentionally vague words that changed the fate of the Jewish people. And I'll read them right now. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur James Balfour.
Really delighted to be here with this audience, and really on the occasion of a very special centenary, an event of historical memory that has enormous contemporary implications. A dinner took place in London just a few hours ago, an evening dinner. They're about 5 hours ahead of us. Two events actually occurred at the same time. Number one, a descendant of the Rothschild family, known as Lord Rothschild, together with a scion of the Balfour family, held a dinner marking the commemoration of the Balfour Declaration, which was issued literally 100 years ago today. A short period away, just a few blocks from what I understand, there was a counter-demonstration, a protest against Britain doing it. So in effect, one event has stimulated totally opposite reactions. For one group, it's celebrated. For another group, it's a crime. It's something to be protested. I'd like to place three questions on the table this evening. Number one, how did this historical event come about? In other words, what brought the Balfour Declaration into reality, into being? Number two, what is its significance in terms of 20th century Jewish history? And thirdly, what is its legacy today? Let me begin then with a few words of background in terms of both Zionist history and British history. Herzl died in 1904. He died at the very young age of 44. He predicted a Jewish state within 50 years of his demise. And he was really off by only 6 years, a remarkable example of predictive powers. What Herzl stood for, what he represented, was let the Jews, the Zionist organization, secure an internationally guaranteed charter under international law to a Jewish homeland. He didn't particularly care whether that homeland would be Palestine or somewhere else. He was, if anything, receptive, very supportive of the so-called Uganda plan. It's oftentimes misunderstood. It was called the Uganda plan not because it was in Uganda, it was in Kenya actually. The Uganda Railway ran through the area that was supposed to be set aside for Jewish settlement. But then, as now, the plan was killed, partly because the Jews didn't want it. Herzl was rebuked for wanting a homeland that was not the historical Jewish homeland. But more importantly, the white settlers in Kenya did not want Jewish competition. They didn't want them moving in. Herzl, to his credit, by the way, did not feel this was the ultimate solution to the Jewish question. He saw it as being much more of a Nachstyle, meaning a place of refuge for the night, a temporary refuge that Jews could go to pending a return to the Jewish homeland. But he died in many ways of a broken heart because this Uganda plan had been roundly defeated. It was actually technically, it got a majority vote within the Zionist organization at the Zionist Congress. But in practice, Herzl, like everyone else, knew you can't win by having 51% of the people behind you. You need a much stronger majority than that. In that respect, though, Herzl's legacy, it's a multifold legacy that would take us much too far afield, But his legacy was that if you don't get Uganda, you need something along the lines of an international charter guaranteeing a Jewish homeland. This was the Basel Program of 1897, the First Zionist Congress. One of the great victories of Herzlian Zionism is that what the Balfour Declaration was fulfillment of the Herzlian vision of a charter under international law that would acknowledge the rights of the Jews to a national homeland in the historical Jewish homeland of the land known as Palestine. But Zionists did not exist in a vacuum. They existed in a world that was much more complicated. The Ottoman Empire was undergoing enormous strains. It controlled Palestine up until 1917. So when Herzl died, he was looking at a country, at a territory that was under Ottoman rule. As it happens, a group of young Jews, we commonly refer to them as the Young Turks, they're actually, how Jewish they were is an interesting question. They weren't overtly Jewish. They were members of an obscure Jewish sect known as the Don Meh, who publicly were somewhat along the lines of Muslims, privately only married among themselves and adhered to certain Jewish traditions. That's a side point. But the real point is that these Jews were instrumental in the so-called Committee for Union and Progress, the CUP, whose program was to modernize Turkey, bring Turkey into the 20th century. Zionists thought that sounded resonant with their own ideals of can't we strike a deal with the Ottoman Empire that Palestine be given over to the Jews, especially given that this Committee of Union and Progress had people of Jewish ancestry at the very center of its work. The trouble is these so-called Young Turks, which is the language that's come down to us, the last thing they were going to give up on was territory within the Ottoman Empire, particularly territory known as Palestine. So that the Herzlian vision appeared to be going nowhere in the aftermath of Herzl's demise. That the whole idea was to get this Jewish homeland, but standing in the way was the empire that actually controlled the land of Palestine at that time. As a result, by 1913, 1 year before World War I, the total number of Zionists in the world, people who were paying the shekel, if you will, which was a symbol of membership in the Zionist movement, the total number was 127,000. Needless to say, that's like a fraction of the Jews in Borough Park today were the members of the Zionist organization at that time. Most people seem to think, say 1913, that Zionism was a visionary movement far off in the future. It had nothing to do with the Jews of today. What was relevant, obviously, was the condition of where the masses of Jews actually lived, namely Russia and Eastern Europe. And those are the people that needed an immediate refuge. So what happens? And this is the second part of this background to the Balfour Declaration. What's happening in terms of Great Britain in the years between Herzl's death and World War I? Britain, as is well known, goes to war alongside Russia and France against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The Ottoman Empire joins that war in 1915 as almost the kind of last gasp of preserving the territorial integrity of the Ottoman Empire. Britain starts making promises. The war is not going all that well. Certainly, one cannot predict an Allied victory. Possibly yes, but possibly no. So what does Britain start doing? You have a series of promises and counter-promises. In 1915, you have the McMahon Letter, which essentially promises an Arab state in the entire area known as the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is a Muslim empire. Britain sends a letter to Arab officials promising an Arab state if the Ottoman Empire is defeated in World War I. It's a war measure. It's done only in secret because they want this to be a secret agreement that may or may not be fulfilled in the aftermath of World War I. A year later, 1960, Britain concludes another secret agreement. Sir Mark Sykes and his French counterpart, Picot, signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement that basically violates the McMahon Letter by saying, yes, there'll be an Arab state, but it will not include Lebanon or Syria, which will become part of the Empire of France. What about Palestine? The Sykes-Picot Agreement is rather vague on this. It says portions of Lebanon west of Beirut. What does west of Beirut mean exactly? Are you talking southwest of Beirut? Are you talking about just direct west of Beirut? All this was left vague. But again, it's a secret agreement that no one in England or in France wanted to be let out, if for no other reason because part of Allied propaganda was that we're the good guys, we're the Democrats. We're not in favor of enslaving people. So a secret agreement to carve up the Middle East between Britain and France would undermine the very principles by which the Allies conducted the war. So then what happens in 1917? Exactly a year ago today. Not a year ago, a century ago today. The British Army is in Palestine. It's doing battle with the Ottoman Empire. It may or may not win, but they issue the declaration that Rabbi Hammerman read earlier, namely, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. That war measure, if you will, is part of a series of promises that Britain issues to various parties, to the Arabs, to France, and now to the Jews. Are the promises reconcilable? To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. But they're all war measures by which Britain is trying to get support, allies, enthusiasm for Britain's cause in the Middle East. Now, Balfour himself was not looking at a Jewish state, and the language of it is important to realize. He said, a Jewish national home in Palestine. That means two very distinct things. It means, number one, we're not talking necessarily about a state. A national home could mean a state, could also not mean a state. Two, the language was deliberately chosen in Palestine as opposed to of Palestine. In other words, the Balfour Declaration left open the question, not only of would there be a Jewish state, but would that Jewish state be in the entire area of Palestine, or did it open the doors, if you will, to what we refer to today as a two-state solution? Second, and again, Rabbi Herman's reading here was very critical, very important, the conclusion to it, nothing shall be done to affect the rights of non-Jews living in Palestine or of Jews living in areas outside of Palestine. Now, this also meant two very distinct things. It meant, on the one hand, that the Zionist project would by no means undermine the civil and religious rights of Arabs living in Palestine, what we refer to today as Palestinians, and that Jews who are living outside of Palestine and have full civil rights elsewhere would not find those rights undermined. The second of those things needs to be understood in the context, again, of British Jewish leadership. Edwin Montagu, one of the leading families of London Jewry, was about to become the representative of the British Crown in India. He opposed the Balfour Declaration by saying, how can I possibly represent the British government, the British Empire, when that same government has already told me that my homeland is not in Britain, but rather in Palestine? What Montagu's statement reflected was a statement of many Jews, especially among the elites of London Jewry, who saw the Balfour Declaration's affirmation of a Jewish homeland as undermining their status elsewhere in the diaspora. The first part of the statement, though, was much more problematical, and that was, could you implement the Balfour Declaration of creating a Jewish national home without damaging the rights of those who are already resident in Palestine but are not Jewish? That was the tension of the Balfour Declaration. Provide a national home for the Jews, but without affecting the status of non-Jews living in Palestine. And Britain very quickly found herself into an impossible situation of how can you reconcile these two promises? We'll talk about Britain's record in Palestine, but I think the first question is why did Britain do this? Now, it's what brought this about? What catalyzed, what stimulated this declaration? There are a host of theories. I'd like to perhaps spend a few minutes on them and perhaps draw some conclusions. Number one, Chaim Weizmann, the successor of Herzl as head of the Zionist organization, he was not the direct successor. David Wolfson was the immediate successor, but Weizmann was the most well-known of Herzl's successors. In his memoirs, he writes that the Balfour Declaration was a reward for his work on the chemical known as acetone during World War I. This is a bit of perhaps personal aggrandizement. Let me put it very simply, is that great powers don't do things to reward individuals for their scientific discoveries. What's fair to say is that while Weizmann was working on acetone, he got to know key figures in the British leadership, particularly David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister of England. Balfour was Foreign Secretary. So yes, Weizmann's discovery of acetone was tangentially related to the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, but was by no means a catalyst for it. Number two, second theory. Was Balfour himself engaging in some compensation for what he had done in 1906, 11 years previously? What he had done in 1906? In 1906, you had a Tory government, a conservative government in England, and it passed under Balfour's leadership, or with Balfour's leadership, it passed the so-called Aliens Act, which ostensibly was limiting Jewish immigration into England. The second theory, is that Balfour issues the Balfour Declaration feeling guilty over his support for the Aliens Act of 1906. Well, again, the trouble with this theory is that, number one, it assumes that great powers do things out of a guilt complex. I've yet to meet such a great power, but I understand it's a fair hypothesis. More importantly is that the Aliens Act was by no means something that was a cause of major consternation for a very simple reason, two reasons. Number one is that the Tory government was quickly thrown out afterwards. It was replaced by a liberal government. Therefore, the people supposedly implementing the Aliens Act were the people who opposed it initially. In other words, you had a liberal government charged with implementing an act that the Tory government had passed over liberal objections. Second, the Aliens Act itself had a loophole. It said it does not apply to those fleeing political persecution. It was a very easy thing to say that Jews coming from Eastern Europe should not be subject to the Aliens Act. And again, if you have a liberal government that didn't believe in the act to begin with, it was fairly easy to subvert it by saying, well, Jews coming here from Russia or Eastern Europe are obviously fleeing persecution. So to suggest that Balfour was guilty about something that happened 12 years earlier, 11 years early, perhaps he had some second thoughts about it, some second regrets. No, I don't believe it catalyzed the Balfour Declaration. But there is a role in terms of a third theory that is related to what might be called folklore or culture. Great Britain and British society, especially upper-class British society, has always seen Britain as a kind of new Israel. Britain is realization of an ancient vision emanating from the Bible. When I say this is particularly endemic in the elite circles of British society, I'm sure it was probably a subject of discussion at the dinner that took place this evening. It's almost a sense of reverence for the Jews of yesteryear as this noble people that gave us the prophets, that gave us the vision of Palestine as their homeland, accompanied by a great deal of social contempt for Jews today. In other words, the very same people that might have supported the Balfour Declaration as realization of reverence for the people of the Bible didn't feel like having people associating with them as Jews today. But in this sense, some of my colleagues like to refer to this as a kind of Jewish mythology or Gentile mythology about Jews, that the Jews of today, like them or not, they're with us, we have to deal with them. But the Jews as a people represent a noble history that is parallel, consonant, emblematic of what Britain aspires to be. In terms of the entire cultural history of Britain, it's some fascinating identifications. Britain identifies with the ancient Trojans. You know, Hector, the Trojan hero, represented the noblest of British society. Hector, obviously, if there was a Hector, he never heard of Britain. But he was absorbed into British culture as emblematic of all that is good, noble, and true. The same thing applied to the Jews of yesteryear. The Jews of the Bible represented that dimension of history that Britain wanted to identify with. Did this affect British policy? Certainly it was on the minds of people like Arthur Balfour and David Lloyd George, that what Britain's role is in history is the realization of this ancient dream of a noble culture emanating from the Middle East. Certainly Disraeli, who was by this time long since passed away, but that was much of the kind of ethos that he represented. His language regarding the Jews was, while Britain was still a swamp, my people were inventing the prophets. In other words, and prophets PH, not FITS. Meaning that the notion of Jewish prophecy, that was emblematic of all that was good and true, and that's what Britain should identify with. I suggest that certainly is a third theory about the Balfour Declaration. I think this one, while it's on the level of mythology and culture, it has a ring of truth behind it. But then you have to look at issues of national state interest. Britain was deeply concerned about the Suez Canal, lifeline of the empire. It's one of the reasons behind the Sykes-Picot Agreement was that France would have Syria and Lebanon, but that would give Britain a free hand in Egypt in terms of protecting the Suez Canal. I'm sure many of you have heard of the famous Singapore strategy, which occurred on Churchill's watch in World War II. It was considered the greatest defeat the British Empire ever had. The entire Singapore strategy was that Singapore would be an impregnable fortress in the Far East. How would that work? Should there be an attack on British possessions, Singapore would be able to hold out until the British fleet could cross the Mediterranean into the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and then come to the rescue of British possessions overseas. Two things quickly. Number one, it didn't work. The Singapore strategy was an incredible defeat for Britain. The Japanese conquered Singapore very quickly in World War II. But number two, the whole Singapore strategy rested upon the Suez Canal, that the British fleet would be able to move quickly from its natural base in Europe, in the Mediterranean, move quickly into the Far East. So protection of the Suez Canal was considered as protection of the lifeline of the empire. The Balfour Declaration should be understood from a strategic point of view as safeguarding Britain's strategic interests in the Middle East. Fifthly, and here you get into, again, mythology, but I think a very real mythology. Russia experienced the revolution in February of 1917, the so-called Kerensky Revolution. You had a provisional government. Provisional government was under attack by the Bolsheviks. Lenin promised land, peace, and bread. Now, if Lenin was going to succeed, which he did by October, 1 month before the Balfour Declaration, the fear was very strong that he'd pull Russia out of the war, which is ultimately what he did. 16% of the Bolshevik leadership were Jews. Trotsky obviously is the best known, but by no means the only one, 16% of the leadership. British concern with the Balfour Declaration was an assumption that if we appeal to the Jews of Eastern Europe, that will keep Russia in the war. One of my colleagues likes to refer to this as constructive anti-Semitism, meaning an overemphasis upon Jewish capacities, but it worked in Jewish interest. It was a very poor analysis, number one, of the Bolsheviks. Yes, 16% of the Bolshevik leadership were Jewish. The last thing they cared about was Palestine. Number two, again, it's an overemphasis on Jewish power. Lenin succeeded precisely by ignoring the masses. Lenin's Bolshevik revolution is very much that of the elites. In many ways, he violated Marxist doctrine. There was not class conflict so much as what Lenin called skipping the stage of class consciousness and taking over at the very top. In other words, the Bolsheviks succeeded, frankly, by the use of terror. But to the point here of why then the Balfour Declaration, a hope that Russian Jewry would keep Russia in the war. If you will, constructive anti-Semitism. But that constructive anti-Semitism was not limited to Eastern Europe. The other concern was the United States. America enters the war in March of 1917. We're talking then about 8 months later. You don't get into a war so quickly. You can declare war, but the question is how much emphasis are you going to place in terms of getting your troops in line, getting your equipment in line. How quickly was America going to come? What Britain was concerned about, and here the documentary record is quite explicit, is, well, where are the Jews of the United States? The leadership is German, and Germany in World War I does not have the imagery of Germany in World War II. In other words, where is Jewish leadership? The Jacob Schiffs, for example. These are Jews of German origin, and the one thing they don't like is Tsarist Russia. And here Britain is fighting alongside Russia, the traditional enemy of the Jews. The fear was that, yes, America has entered into the war, but the Jews of America, on the one hand, could play an incredibly constructive role if they urge America to go full square in, or they could play a negative role, given that so many Jewish leaders are neutral on the question because of their German orientation and their antipathy to Russia, which remains, if you will, still a British ally in terms of the Triple Entente. Again, constructive anti-Semitism, an appeal to American Jewry over the heads of the United States to get America into the war and into the war quickly. But there's yet another document, in this case a set of documents, that Britain did this for yet a totally different reason. A fear that if Britain didn't do it, the German Foreign Office would do it. In other words, that Germany would come to the fore. Again, German leadership is by no means anti-Semitic. On the contrary, it's regarded very favorably by Jews. And they are seriously considering something like a Balfour Declaration. What retards this and ultimately prevents it is the Ottoman Empire. In other words, Germany will not turn against her ally. But Britain wasn't all that certain about that. In other words, there was a real concern that if Britain didn't issue a Balfour Declaration, someone else would, and would not redound to British credit. A couple of other factors here which are interesting. We've discovered a document in very recent years that the Ottoman Empire itself was considering something like a Balfour Declaration, but not the way Britain considered it. The Ottoman Empire was considering a document that, again, it did not issue, that called for lifting all immigration restrictions of Jews into Palestine. What the Ottoman Empire had in mind was not a political entity, such as a Jewish national home, what they called a religious center of Judaism in the historical homeland of the Jews. This was August 1918. In other words, a full 11 months after 10 months after the Balfour Declaration. But it shows you that the ideas of the Balfour Declaration did even have some resonance, even in the Ottoman Empire. But I think most importantly, and this is something, again, that's been ignored in the historical record, is the role of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson did not offer public support for a Balfour Declaration. He offered private support for it. And that private support was critical, that Britain, in issuing it, knew that it was not acting alone, that it had the support of its primary ally, the United States. Why did Wilson do that? Heavily influenced by Justice Brandeis. Again, seen historically, it's a bit odd, a judge on the Supreme Court influencing American foreign policy. Now, you might do a double take and say, is this kosher? It was 100 years ago, different time. I'm not sure what would have happened today. But the bottom line is that what Brandeis represented was the power of the American Jewish community to influence United States policy. And as I said in an earlier session, the greatness of America is that no society in diaspora Jewish history has provided as much leeway for the exercise of collective Jewish politics, collective minority interests, as has the United States. That's an incredible blessing. And Wilson's support for the Balfour Declaration, without which the Balfour Declaration may not have been possible, that support for it was testimony to the influence of American Jews. What is its aftermath? What is its significance historically? In the immediate aftermath, Balfour himself did not want a British mandate in Palestine. He wanted an American mandate. Interestingly, the Zionist organization opposed this for two distinct reasons. They said, America, if given a mandate in Palestine, will try to mold that mandate in its image as a democracy. What does that image of democracy mean? Well, I got news for you. There's 640,000 Arabs in Palestine and 60,000 Jews. In other words, do you give 10% of the people a land that is 90% of a different group. This has been the Arab critique of the Balfour Declaration from 1917 down to 2017, that Britain gave away something it had no right to give away. It's a subject I want to return to before I close. The second reason that Balfour opposed that the Zionist organization opposed an American mandate is that they were concerned about where U.S. foreign policy would be. That once they enter into Palestine, American oil interests will embroil the United States in ways that will not be favorable to the Zionist cause. Rather prescient observation back in 1917, and we've had a long history on that since. A second aftermath was perhaps the only real agreement that the Zionist organization found within the Arab world at the time. It was the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement of 1919. Remember, go back to the McMahon letters. Britain promised an Arab empire on the residue of the Ottoman Empire. Faisal expected to become leader of that king, whatever you want to call him, king of that, or caliph of that Arab state between the Nile and the Euphrates. The Faisal-Weizmann agreement was very simple. Weizmann said, "You'll have that Arab state. We just want 1/2 of 1%. Faisal said, "We welcome the Jews with open arms." And, again, it's not that significant to us. The significance of Faisal-Weizmann agreements, on the one hand, it's very short-lived. On the other hand, it's long-lasting implications. The agreement itself meant very little in the short run because Faisal was thrown out. In other words, he was a would-be king who did not become a king. He was thrown out of Syria, and as a compensation, he was given something in Iraq. Saddam Hussein is a descendant of the Faisal family. Two, it reflected Zionist ability to strike a deal, not with the Arabs in the street, not with the Palestinians, if you will, rather with a family that was far removed from Palestine and had really very little on-the-ground connection with it. In other words, there was no agreement with the Arabs in Palestine. It was an agreement with a far-off Arab empire. That Arab empire never came to pass, and therefore Faisal declared the agreement to be null and void in the short run. In the long run, it reflects what I would call one of the strategies of the Zionist movement, which again has implications to this day, of perhaps agreements can be struck with Arab leaders in their self-interest. The problem with that is what about the Arabs in the street and what happens there? And that's been one of the tensions and contradictions in the Arab-Zionist conflict for the last 100 years. Thirdly, though, the high tide of Zionism occurs 2 years later in the San Remo Treaty and following declaration. The San Remo Treaty concluded the war between Britain and France by extension and the Ottoman Empire. Okay? It laid the groundwork for the end of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of Ataturk, who established the Republic of Turkey, and the term Ottoman became relegated to your furniture, if you will. In other words, it was only then afterwards it was only of historical interest. After the San Remo Treaty is concluded in 1921, a year later, you have a declaration announcing the treaty with a specific clause awarding Britain a mandate in Palestine. What's the purpose of that mandate? The preamble to the San Remo Declaration is the Balfour Declaration. It's repeated word for word as the preamble, meaning that Britain is right to be in Palestine in order to implement the Balfour Declaration. This is often seen as being the high tide of Zionism, that the Balfour Declaration, number one, has now been cemented in international law, exactly what Herzl wanted, an internationally guaranteed charter to a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Two, a superpower is charged with implementing the Balfour Declaration. This was cause for rejoicing within the Jewish world. Just to give you a sense of numbers here, I said there were only 127,000 Zionists in 1913, people who paid the shekel. By 1923, that number had increased to 730,000. In other words, almost a 7,000% increase in a brief decade. A lot of that is the Balfour Declaration and the support for it. But Britain very quickly realizes that the Balfour Declaration is a two-sided promise the two promises don't coexist all that easily. One is the promise of a Jewish national home. The other is nothing will be done to undermine the rights of non-Jews living in Palestine. Can you implement both sides, or does one side have to come at the expense of the other side? Winston Churchill becomes head of the Colonial Office. Again, his own biography here is fascinating. Churchill's career had hit somewhat of a nadir after Gallipoli. Gallipoli was the famous naval battle in 1915, which Churchill at the time was head of the Admiralty, the Navy, what we would call the Secretary of the Navy, more or less, although he didn't have that title. And the Gallipoli campaign was his brainchild. It was a major defeat, and Churchill essentially was relegated to the backbenchers. He switched parties. He left the Tory party and became a liberal. And as a reward, he was, for switching parties, as a figure influential in politics, he entered into being the head of the British Colonial Office, with obvious responsibility, not just for Palestine, but for all British colonies. Churchill issued in 1923 the Churchill White Paper. The White Paper is very simple. It took the Jordan River and said the Balfour Declaration applies only west of the Jordan River and not east of it. The implications of that were very profound. It meant, number one, that 70% of the area known as Palestine was not subject to the Balfour Declaration. Two, it represented what might be called a reasonable compromise, namely that you have two conflicting claims. A Jewish claim to Palestine based upon the Bible and the fact that Jews need a refuge. An Arab claim to Palestine that 90% of the population is Palestinian and not Jewish. So what do? You be Solomonic. You split it down the middle. You partition it. The partition being the Jordan River. There was very little outcry in the Jewish world about this because the number of Jews affected was somewhere along the lines of 3. Meaning Jews were living east of the Jordan. They relocated and the world went on. There was one major exception. Vladimir Jabotinsky refuses to accept this, and he establishes what he calls the New Zionist Organization. We later popularly termed revisionist Zionism. We usually think revisionism means a move to the right. That's communist language, if you will. But the real point was Jabotinsky and his followers believed, they had a pet slogan, Shnei Gadim LeYarden. There are two banks of the Jordan. Hachad Shalanu, one is ours. Hasheni Gamken, the second is as well. So Jabotinsky refused to accept this partition. There's a long history here we can go into another time of Ben-Gurion thought Jabotinsky was a fascist. Many Jews agreed with him. I'd say the real Jabotinsky was much more complex than that. And it's difficult, if not impossible, to pigeonhole him. There are many sides of Jabotinsky that we would call British liberalism. There are other sides of Jabotinsky that are more problematical. Subject for another time, but the real point is that outside of Jabotinsky, the Churchill White Paper aroused very little opposition within the Jewish community. The opposition crystallizes in terms of the rest of British rule in Palestine. For the first 16 years, 1922 to 1938, any assessment of it, I would say, is that Britain tried to steer a middle course between these two conflicting claims. In the process of doing that, they satisfied no one. The Arabs felt they were getting a raw deal. The Jews felt they were getting a raw deal. Britain, with the best of intentions, was trying to muddle through, which was a phrase used in British diplomacy. Somehow or other, we'll get through this. Didn't mean they had an ultimate plan, but they were trying to satisfy two mutually contradictory claims to the same piece of land. Again, if you're talking about contemporary implications, I'll conclude with that in a second, but bear in mind that any attempt to understand the Arab-Zionist conflict needs to begin and then return over and over again to one simple point, that it's a conflict between two peoples with conflicting claims to the same piece of territory. The Solomonic solution that Churchill developed as early as 1922, I would argue remains the only realistic solution. Namely, you can't have these two people simply live together. You've got to somehow partition it into different areas. We'll come back to that before I conclude. That said, in 1938, Britain decides that the policy of trying to satisfy both sides is simply unworkable. In the meantime, the shadows of war are all over Europe. Britain's policy in the Middle East shifts pronouncedly that says basically, we don't need Arab support, but we do need Arab neutrality. In other words, we have no illusions or expectations that the Arab world will come to our assistance, but we do want them to stay neutral because they can make our life very miserable. Therefore, what do? We can't implement both sides of the Balfour Declaration, so let's opt for one side. The obvious implication was that the Jews will be with us no matter what we do, because who are the enemies here? It's not the United States. It's not a power that's benign in terms of Jews. It's Nazi Germany. It's obvious the Jews have no choice. Anthony Eden, Foreign Secretary, in 1938 said it very simply: if we must have choices, I prefer Arabs to Jews. Meaning that Britain was making a very hard-nosed political calculation that if we have to choose between these two powers, these two entities, we choose the Arab power. So what does Britain do? 1939, the worst possible moment in Jewish history, Britain issues the White Paper of 1939. What does that do? It limits Jewish immigration to 75,000 over the next 5 years, 25,000 immediately, and then 10,000 a year for the next 5 years. After that, future Jewish immigration subject to an Arab veto, and after 10 years, a unitary Arab state in Palestine. This was a clear abandonment of the Balfour Declaration. As it happens, the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations met in 1940, once the war had broken out, and declared that the White Paper was a violation of Britain's very raison d'etre to be in Palestine. In other words, Britain had been awarded a mandate to implement the Balfour Declaration, and Britain was saying very openly, we're not implementing it, we're abandoning it. Of course, the declaration by the League of Nations in 1940 was not exactly the most momentous declaration, not exactly something that's going to sway minds internationally, but it did say, at least from the principle of international right, what Britain had done was completely against the purpose of Britain being there. That said, I want to make two other observations. This came about, obviously, at the worst possible moment in Jewish history. Everyone has their if only about the Holocaust. My if only is, had Britain accepted the Peel Commission, which was the last attempt to implement the Balfour Declaration in 1938 by partition, by what we would call the two states. It wasn't two states. What they wanted to do was set up cantons. Some cantons would be open to free Jewish immigration. It would not have averted the Holocaust, but it would have sharply reduced its dimensions. That's my if only about the Holocaust. So Britain did this at the worst possible moment in Jewish history. That said, before we engage in British bashing, let's realize what Britain did do at the same time. Churchill was under enormous pressure to take Britain out of the war. After June of 1940, Britain was fighting alone for a full year. During that year, the pressure to pull out, to conclude a peace treaty, which would have preserved the British Empire, because that was the terms that Hitler was offering. The pressure was intense. To this day, there are conservative historians in England that write that Churchill betrayed England by not signing a peace treaty with Hitler. Churchill had the wisdom, the courage, the foresight to realize that British-style democracy, Western civilization, could not coexist with Nazi Germany. More than just the foresight of realizing that, he had the influence over Roosevelt, who effectively became his protege for all intents and purposes, in making sure that Britain would fight on, the famous Lend-Lease arrangements between the United States and Britain, and ultimately fight to victory in 1945. So one qualification here is that while you might say British policy in Palestine was morally at its nadir in 1939 with the White Paper, realize the factors that permitted Britain to continue one of the most courageous acts in world history, and it's the reason why we declared Churchill to be the man of the 20th century. The real moral nadir is not 1939 to 45. The real moral nadir is the White Paper was enforced even after 1945. In other words, once the war was over, Churchill was out of power. The Labour Party, which had campaigned against him precisely on the White Paper issue, saying that this was a morally bankrupt act. Churchill himself had said it's wrong, but he refused to abrogate it because of the price to be paid in terms of Arab neutrality, which is what they were searching. But after 1945, with the full knowledge of what had taken place, with the full awareness of Jews who desperately wanted to get to Palestine, the White Paper was enforced until May 15, 1948. So what do we learn from all this, and what is its significance today? I've touched on some of the themes, and I just want to bring them out into the open before we conclude. Number one is that the Jewish state is conceived in 1917. 1917 is the moment of conception. It's the moment when pregnancy begins, if you will. And that is fulfillment of Herzl's vision, and we owe Britain an enormous debt of gratitude for taking in effect the Herzlian vision and bringing it into reality. That's, I think, the major statement of what the Balfour Declaration has meant. It meant the initial conception of the Jewish state. Two, and I alluded to this earlier, is that the Balfour Declaration was a problem in terms of the moral concerns that 640,000 Arabs, their claims are shunted aside in favor of the claims of 50, 60,000 Jews. By 1922, and when the Balfour Declaration becomes law under the San Remo Declaration, the numbers have risen to something like 84,000 Jews. So it's a little bit less than 90% at that point. So it's 85%. But the bottom line is that remains a moral problem that I would submit Jews today oftentimes are much too quick to overlook. That there is a Jewish case to Palestine based upon history, the Bible, and the need for a refuge. There is an Arab case for Palestine based on the sheer demographic reality of who are the people there in the land itself. Three, the Balfour Declaration, as I said, opens the door to partition by its careful use of language. In Palestine, creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. It's that language that was carefully crafted. It opens the door to partition. The partition initially occurs in 1922. The later partition occurs in 1947 with the creation of the State of Israel. Again, here one can and should say that there was no reason why a Palestinian state did not come into being in 1947 except for Arab rejectionism of the very idea of a Jewish state. Not the fact that in 1947, basically the State of Israel was about to be 55% of the area west of the Jordan. In other words, a sharply reduced Jewish state. It wasn't even a contiguous Jewish state. It was divided up into three. There would be a state of Palestine that, roughly speaking, was going to be Judea and Samaria, what we call today the West Bank, and Western Galilee. Also, in other words, divided up into two different parts. Jerusalem was to be internationalized. But the bottom line is that while Ben-Gurion was willing to live with that, saying, let's take a Jewish state now, the Palestinian response, the Arab response was, no Jewish state whatsoever. Now, that has been a pattern that was repeated in 1978 with the Camp David Accords, concluded under Jimmy Carter's tutelage, 1993, the Oslo Accords, most importantly, Camp David in 2000 under Clinton, the Sharon disengagement in 2004 from Gaza, and the Olmert Plan of 2008. All of these opened the door to a Palestinian state. Each time the answer was no, no, no. So in that respect, Palestinian rejectionism is the real reason why there's no Palestinian state. The Balfour Declaration opened the door to it. I would argue today that it remains the only realistic solution. But the reason is not materialized is continued Arab rejection, a desire, if you will, to see no Jewish state whatsoever, on whether it's 1 inch or whether it's whether it's 300 miles or whatever is the total width of Palestine or the Jewish state. That I'd suggest is one of those are some of the things that are the lasting legacy. But I think there is history has its ways of playing tricks on us in different ways. The late Shimon Peres called the Camp David Accords of 2000. They were not accords because they weren't agreed to, but the Camp David proposals of 2000. He called them a Balfour Declaration for the Palestinians. Again, everyone has their if only. If only that had been accepted, the page of history could have been turned, and we'd say we're on a new leaf. But ultimately, the Camp David Accords failed, not because the Israeli government was not prepared to recognize and create a Palestinian state, so much as because the Palestinian would-be state was less interested in Palestinian sovereignty than it was in rejectionism of Israel. But by way of conclusion, though, I think the real comment here is that the Balfour Declaration represents a period of history that is still with us in different ways. For the Jews, it's something to remember as what I call the conception moment of the birth of Israel. For the Palestinian Arabs, it's the Nakba, catastrophe, a violation, a betrayal. Britain was doing things, promising things that had no right to promise. For others, it's simply part of the historical record. I think it's to Britain's credit that, as exemplified by the dinner this evening, is that Britain has refused to apologize for the Balfour Declaration. It continues to mark it, it continues to remember it as part of history. We all have our issues in terms of British society and its relationship to Israel and British politics, but recognize that when we speak of the legacy and significance of the Balfour Declaration, Britain was there at the moment of the conception of Israel. It betrayed some promises later on. It first tried for 20 years, close to 20 years, it tried to steer a middle ground. The middle ground was unworkable. Britain betrayed the Balfour Declaration at the worst possible moment in Jewish history. But the fact that it continues to stand by it today is a statement of the legality of Israel under international law. That was the Herzlian vision. The fact that Israel is created ultimately by a UN declaration, a UN partition plan of 1947, and that the Jewish state comes into being, should be a strong reminder to Jews that while we have all sorts of issues with the world around us, we also have friends in the world around us. And that's not a small statement. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.